Now we have Cherie Haury-Artz. She is the assistant educator at the University of Iowa. Is that correct?
Yeah, Office of the State Archaeologist.
Office of the State Archaeologist. So she's here to talk about archaeology in Iowa.
Yeah. Specifically today, talking about technology, how people survived. So this is one of my favorite talks to give. So the first thing we have to do is eliminate the idea of primitive from our brains. People who survived in the past, not only Native Americans, which is what I study and what I'll be talking about today, but all of our ancestors. If they had figured out how to do it, none of us would be here, right? So the knowledge fascinates me of what people had to know in order to survive and to lead a good life. I had a teacher tell me once that she felt so sorry for people, the pre-contact people, that it must have been such a struggle for, to survive and, living hand to mouth. And I thought, no, not really. They had toys, they had games. We have a 7,000-year-old flute from Cherie, Iowa. They had music, they had art, they had a good life. It was different. It was pre-technology, that's for sure, pre-industrial, I would say. But I want to talk today about some of the many things that people had to know and how they did things. So, advance, yay. So because I study Native Americans, I think it's really important to acknowledge the Native American tribes who have lived here and who all of these tribes on this list still exist. They're still around. They still, even though they may not live in Iowa now, they still maintain an interest in Iowa. Their ancestors have connections here. So it's really important to recognize this. And this is just the tribes that we can identify that we know were associated here. People have been living in Iowa for more than 13,000 years. There were a lot of Native Americans through here, but we know all of these tribes have connections to the state of Iowa. This is the University of Iowa's land acknowledgement, recognizing that all of these people lived here. They are taking steps, which I hope will be an ongoing thing. So anyone who is a member of one of these tribes can attend the University of Iowa paying in-state tuition, recognizing the fact that their people were forced out of the state, but they still should be able to take advantage of some of these things that we have. We also have First Nations camp, where we bring in young people from all over North America, primarily, especially Iowa, but they can come from other areas. That's the First Nations camp. These kids get to visit. They spend a week at the university. They visit classrooms and things like that. And they just get an idea of what the place is like and what it feels like to be on college campuses. So there are some important steps being taken to recognize the injustices that have been done in the past. So, technologies, people who first, who figured all this stuff out, these were scientific innovations. They had to understand chemistry, physics, engineering, natural history. You had to know what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. Well, you eat that one, it'll kill you. You had to know how to get it, how to process it. I have always been impressed that people, acorns are full of tannic acid, not good for you to eat. And yet, somebody somewhere back in the dim, dark past figured out that if you bury them in ash and pour boiling water over it, ash is a base, and that neutralizes the acid in the acorns and then turns it into an edible foodstuff. Who figured that out? That's chemistry. And entire cultures in California are based on acorns. So somebody figured it out. There's all kinds of amazing things that people had to understand. So how do we know? Archaeologists, we find all this stuff in the ground, and we then have to figure out how it was made, what it was used for, things like that. Two primary sources of information. One is experimental archaeology. This is a lot of fun. This is trying it ourselves. People teach themselves how to flint knap. How do you do that? How do you make an arrowhead or a spear point? In this location, these are people experimenting with building a wickiup, which is the kind of house that the Iowa and the Oto and the Ho-Chunk lived in. We're asking questions. How long did it take to make a tool? How long will it last? What happens when it breaks? What materials are best? Where do you get the raw materials? Did you travel? Did you trade? How did you do that? The other source of information we have is ethnographic information, and that is asking the descendants of the people who did it themselves. We have some early descriptions, people like Lewis and Clark, who spent a lot of time with Native Americans and kept records in their journals of what they were doing, how it was going on. We also have interviews. I rely a lot on a woman named Buffalo Bird Woman, who was a Hidatsa. She lived at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. She spent a lot of time with an anthropologist named Gilbert Wilson, who he was kind of unique for that time period because A, he talked to a woman. Many anthropologists just sort of ignored the women and talked to the men because they looked really cool and they were the hunters and they were the warriors. But the women were the ones who were building the houses and doing the farming and making the clothing. And not only did Gilbert Wilson talk to the women, but he just wrote down what they said. He didn't interpret it. He didn't edit it. He just took her words, Buffalo Bird Woman's words, and several other women he also interviewed. This is really valuable. They lived in North Dakota, but they lived in earth lodges and things like that, which that information continues down into Iowa. And we can talk to Native Americans, the descendants living today. They have a long, deep oral history. The story of Easter Island always comes to my mind. You know, the big statues on Easter Island, the huge heads, and archaeologists, anthropologists, people tried to figure out forever and ever, how did they transport those enormous stone statues? How did they erect them? And then finally somebody asked the people who lived there, and they said, oh, we can show you how you do that. You pry it up and you put a few rocks under it, and then you put ropes on it, you pull it up and you pile rocks under it a little bit more, and you pull it up and you pile more, and they're like, oh, ask the people who were there. The same thing was, and I'm going to blank on it, there was a British expedition that was lost in the Arctic Sea trying to find the Northwest Passage. Expedition after expedition after expedition went up trying to find what happened to them. Finally, they asked the local Inuit population. They said, oh, you mean those masts sticking up out of the water over there? Ask the people. They know these stories have been passed down for generations. Native American cultures especially have they educated their children, it was all oral tradition. They didn't have handwriting, so when the kids learned, they had to recite back, and they did not a summary, not your version of it, back exactly what your parents or your grandparents taught you. And that's how the knowledge was passed generation to generation. So these are the sources of the information. So when I tell you such and such happened, it's probably something we learned from these combinations of bits of information. So hunting is always one of the first things we come up to. Animals were an important resource. In fact, this is the Mall of the Americas. All apologies to Minnesota, but look at the kinds of things that you get from one dead buffalo. You get hides to make homes with, to make clothes with, to make shoes with. This is a bull boat. This is something that I will use my handy dandy spear. This is a round boat that the Hidatsa and the Arikara and the Mandan used up in the Missouri River Valley up in North Dakota. A funny story, Lewis and Clark, they were horribly embarrassed. They had just paddled upstream from St. Louis, not an easy task, and they spent their first winter with the Mandan in North Dakota, and they would see these women plop these round boats in the Missouri River and paddle across, and his men would plop a boat into the river, and they'd paddle in circles because they couldn't figure out how to steer a round boat. They were so embarrassed. They were supposed to be ace paddlers by this point. You get sinew from animals for making cordage. This is, going back to joy and music, these are the hoof coverings from a buffalo, the chitin that covers the outside of the hoofs. This is a musical instrument. This would have been tied around someone's ankles or their shins, and it rattles as you dance. If you've ever been to a powwow, you see women wearing jingle dresses now with metal jingles on them, but these are the original kinds of things. So, oh, and then we use the bones. These bones here are used for hide processing. This one with the little serrated, notched edges for scraping all the goo and stuff off the inside of the hide. This one with the smoother edge is more a later stage in the tanning process. So the bones, the sinew, the hides, besides the fact that you have 2,000 pounds of meat going along with it. Plant resources, obviously, they were fuel, it was building materials, artwork, basketry, things like that, fuel for fires, building materials for building your homes. And these plants here, this is goosefoot or lamb's quarter. Its official name is Chenopodium. It was one of the first domesticated plants in the state of Iowa. It was domesticated 3,000 years ago, along with sunflowers, which were used for the seeds and for the oil, but you could also use their stems as fire starters. It's got that styrofoamy pith kind of stuff down the middle and the shaggy, hairy stems that you light on fire and stick it in there and it'll help catch the rest of the wood. So animal resources, plant resources. So let's talk about hunting. To go hunting, you need something sharp and pointy in order to kill things, pretty much. But then once you've killed it, I mean, everybody always wants to talk about arrowheads and spear points. You still have a lot of work to do once it's dead. So you still have to butcher that thing, and you have to process the hides and things like that. So we will look at some of the stone tools. One of the first, we actually start a little bit back, earliest hunting lessons were probably handheld spears, where you had to walk up to the animal and stab it and then run away quickly because it was probably not very happy. But sometime, and this is something archaeologists can argue about, some people believe that the atlatl came over the Bering Land Bridge with some of the earliest arrivals in the state. Other people saying we have evidence that they were using handheld spears here. Sometime, very early on, the atlatl appears. Atlatl is an Aztec word that we've co-opted. It's a stick with a hook on the end of it. But what it does is, it's physics. So if I was just to throw a spear, I would use my arm and my shoulder. This is the lever. So this is where the power comes from, this way. If I have an atlatl, if I had more elbows, I could throw it harder and farther, right? So by holding an atlatl in my hand, I've created a third lever right here. So now I can do this, and I can do that. And if I put my dart here, look, there's a third elbow. So now I've got this zigzag thing going on. So I have this force, I have this force, and I have this one. So I've tripled the amount of leverage to throw it. That's physics. I've also doubled the length of my arm. So if I'm throwing with my hand, it gets about 3 feet away from my body, and I let go, and immediately it starts losing force. This way I can push it 6 feet away from my body before it starts losing it. So as simple, stick with a hook on the end of it, improved the distance you could throw it, the depth of the penetration when it hits the animal, and the fact that you didn't have to get up quite so up close and personal with the animal you're working on. So atlatls are a lot of fun, an interesting bit of physics to work. The bow and arrow technology shows up about 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in Iowa. So people have been here for more than 13,000 years, so that's a long time using atlatls and darts. When the bow and arrow shows up, that's a very complex kind of material to have to use. The choices of materials, they had to know what kind of wood was best. You don't want bendy wood that's you want something that's hard. You want something that's flexible for your bow. They learned to put backing on the bow. They would use sinew or antler or something to strengthen the back of the bow, using elk or mountain sheep or bison. Caribou antlers could also be used. They had preference of woods for the bow: ash, hickory, locust, osage, orange, cedar, juniper, oak, walnut, birch, choke cherry, service berry, and mulberry. You have to understand the effects of humidity and temperature on your bow. This was a complicated piece of technology. A backed bow is a combination of wood with sinew reinforcement. That was probably the earliest kind. And then we get composite bows, which have horn or antler along with sinew to backing it. Now, in order to back it, you have to invent glue to attach that. It could be made out of animal hides. It could also be made out of animal hooves. Same way they've been making glue for a long time. If you talk about the horse going to the glue factory, it was using the hooves. And now you have to find a kind of string for your bowstring. Plant fibers were usually used: basswood, slippery elm, cherry, or yucca. Sometimes you could also use sinew from the back or the leg tendons, which are long enough in some animals, or rawhide or gut. So for a long time in Iowa, we see the bow and arrow and the atlatl and dart run side by side. So arrows, true arrows, are little guys. You don't want a big giant thing on the end of your arrow, or it'll just, too heavy. So you can see the difference between a dart point and an arrowhead. But we find them both together. And, question is interesting. Why? Why is that? And I talked to John Whitaker at Grinnell College. This is his field of a specialty of research. And one of the things he told me was, the first bows probably weren't all that great. This is a technology that was developing. So there might have been some people who were just like, I'm going back to my atlatl. This is too much work. But a bow and arrow, it's more accurate. It's a longer range, higher velocity. You could carry a whole lot of these compared to how many of these you can carry in your quiver or something like that. There's a smaller range of motion involved. You don't have to stand back and go like that. Stealthier, you can hide behind trees and things like that. Better in the forest, and you can shoot straight up, if you're looking for a duck dinner. However, an atlatl, this is my favorite atlatl. It's just a stick. It's a forked stick. You break off one end and sharpen it to a point, you've got an atlatl. You could go out in the woods with a sharp knife and come back in 10 minutes with an atlatl, as opposed to all that process we were talking about before, making the bow, making the arrow, backing it, waiting for it to dry, you know, like that. Manufacturing, you can go out and make one quickly. It has a greater force and penetration. The size of that arrow, the spear point on the top, that will create a lot more bleeding, more hemorrhaging in the animal than the tiny little arrow. So you can use it with one hand. Why would you ask? You might want to use it with one hand. Well, if somebody's shooting back at you, you might want to hold up a shield and you can still throw some, you know, a spear. So there might be reasons to use one hand. It's also egalitarian. I've had 4-year-olds out throwing darts with atlatls. I can do it. I'm an old lady. It doesn't take a lot of strength. When you talk about bows, they talk about something with a 40-pound draw, how much force it takes to pull it back here. This takes no force. It's all physics. Use the force, Luke. It's easy to do. So men, women, elderly, juveniles, all kinds of people can use one. It doesn't take long to learn. I usually take people out, and usually about the 3rd time, they get used to it and are pretty good. In the cold, wet conditions, you can do it with heavy gloves on. I'm down with that. I don't like having cold hands. So there are pros and cons to both of these hunting technologies. In order to make your points, you also have to know what kind of rock you can use. Any old rock won't do it. It has to be chert. It has to be something with a high silica content. Obsidian is the best, natural glass, but we don't have many volcanoes in Iowa, so that had to be traded in. But here's a piece of obsidian. This is chert. This is local stuff that you could use, and you have to have your hammerstone and know how to break off a flake. Now the flakes, try not to get crumbs all over your carpet. The flake itself is actually super sharp, but the edge is really thin and it would crumble easily. So then you would use a pressure flaking tool, an antler or something like that, to shape it into the final shape that you want. So they had to know where those raw materials were. They had to know how to get them out. They had to understand the properties of flint knapping. So these are some of the raw materials that we have. These are local. Burlington chert, Bethany Falls chert. Knife River flint comes down from North Dakota, although sometimes you can find it in the gravel, the glacial till, because the glacials went across North Dakota on their way down to Iowa. But those, you know, it's crumbled. It's had a rough trip being dragged down under a glacier. But we know for a fact that they traded it out of North Dakota. We also know that obsidian was sometimes traded into Iowa as well. Here is the properties that you need. Silica-rich rocks work like water. So if you strike it, here's the striking platform up here. There's a big bulge where the force immediately hits. So if you drop a rock in water, there's a big sploosh, and then the ripples go away. When you strike a rock, there's a big bulge from the force, and then you can see the ripples go away. People had to understand that. So I'm going to pass these off for you to see. If you look at these, here's the striking platform here. Here's the bulge. And if you run your finger across it, you can feel the ripples. And here's my little piece of obsidian, which really shows it. That's why I like obsidian, because you can really see and feel the ripples. So go ahead and take a look at those and feel how sharp the edges are, too. So this conchoidal fracture, just like glass, is what people learn to control. So if you can control the force and the angle, You can shape it the way you want to. You guys may remember, I remember, before safety glass, if a pebble hit your windshield, a cone would pop out the other end. That's conchoidal fracture. Glass is obsidian natural glass. So the force is hit here, and the cone pops out the other side. So it's called the Hertzian cone of percussion. Probably no pre-contact person knew that, but that's what it's called. So if I strike it, I hit it here, the force goes like that, and this little cone pops out. So if I know where to hit it and how to hit it, I can take advantage of that. If I strike it just right, I can get this nice thin flake to use. So lots of people have taught themselves to flint knap, to create the core. The core is the piece, like an apple core, that the bites have been taken off of. And we find cores in the ground. This is a core. And we find the flakes, and then we find the tools that are made from them. So archaeologists like finding all the garbage as well. So that garbage helps us piece together the steps that it took to do it. But you have to know how to do this. When I try flint knapping with my kids in my College for Kids class, these are middle school aged kids, and the first thing they want to do is just pound on the rock. No, you gotta hit it at just the right angle so that the flake comes off right. If you just pound on it straight, all you're gonna do is just crush up your rock. So there is, again, some understanding of the natural properties of the rock, and then how to control the force as you're shaping it. So again, here we're just looking at your flake. You can see the striking platform, the bulb of percussion, and the ripples that come out. Archaeologists, experimental archaeologists, have discovered that if you hit it with a rock, or a billet made from like an elk antler or a moose antler, that's a hard hammer, and you get a tiny little scar here. And the bulb of percussion is bigger. Whereas if you are doing pressure flaking, you don't get that Aurelier scar, and you don't get that big bulb. So we can begin to, from our own experiments, look at a flake and tell what kind of tool they used to make it with. And there's the forces. But there are other kinds of rocks too. We get a lot of rocks because obviously they don't deteriorate. This is groundstone technology. This is a totally different kind of rock. You don't need the silica-rich rocks. You need things like basalt and granite and things like that. And not very many archaeologists experiment with groundstone technology. Everybody flint knaps. But this stuff is taking your rock and going peck, 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 and then grinding it, using sand to shape it, things like that. Takes hundreds of hours to make one of these. And I can imagine sitting there next to somebody going like this all evening long. He's like, would you please take that somewhere else? Pick, pick, pick. But this little axe is not going anywhere. It's made of granite. So once you've spent all that time making your groundstone axe, it will last a long time. And then you can see you can keep sharpening it. You grind it in the sand and make it sharp again. And we find all kinds of groundstone tools. So this is what we call a 3/4 grooved axe, because there's no groove on the top. Sometimes you find them when it's grooved all the way around. And this is how it was hafted. So you had a wooden handle here and strapped it together like that. The way you chopped with these, a lot of people look at them and say, it's not very sharp. But then, talking to our ethnographic friends, the descendants, they say, well, if you take a tree, a dead tree, and you put mud around the base of it, and then you burn the bottom. The mud keeps it from burning your whole log. And then you can take your axe and chip away the charred material and burn some more and chip it away. And then you can fell your tree. And then you can take your other ground stone tool. So this axe, if you look at it, it's bilaterally symmetrical. This little guy, if you look at it, it's not. It's bull-nosed on this side and flat on this side. This is an adze, so this was used like this. So now I'm hollowing out a log to make a canoe or something like that. You could also use it as like a plane. So we have different kinds. These are woodworking tools. So when we find these, it's pretty rare that we're going to find anything made out of wood in Iowa. It's just not going to preserve. But we find woodworking tools, and we know they were making things out of wood. We also find grinding stones. This is one of the little lightweight ones that I use for transporting. It's probably started with a natural depression, but this has been pecked out. So you can grind corn or quinoa pod seeds or other things like that. And this one is more of a pestle than a mano, but these grinding stones for sure as well. So there's lots of things you can make with ground stone, including, where'd you go? Beautiful artwork. This is a pipe. This is also ground stone technology. This is pipestone, which is a very soft kind of rock. So you can actually cut it with a stone tool into a blank shape, but then you use that pecking and the grinding and the polishing as well. And you can create some really lovely items. So here's our celt and our asymmetrical axe profile. Sandstone. Sandstone's a lovely rock to work with. Works just like sandpaper. So if you need to make a nice straight arrow shaft, and we found these down in Glenwood. It's a pair of sandstone abraders. It works just like a hot dog bun. Sandwich it in there, slide it back and forth, and it does it evenly, so you don't have too much off one side, not enough off the other side, things like that. Or sometimes we find chunks of sandstone, just grooves used every which way, and that might be for sharpening a piece of bone or a piece of wood. We'll never find the wood, and making awls and needles and things like that out of them too. Hammers, stones, different ways of hafting these things. Sometimes we find some of them are just smashing, banging, hammering tools, as well as axes and adzes and things like that. These are some of my favorite artifacts in the whole world. These little pipes. They're stone pipes from eastern Iowa, down and around in Louisa County. Little bears, little frogs. They're just gorgeous artwork. These are made out of a pipestone, a green pipestone that comes from central Illinois. This red pipestone, which we find a lot of other things made out of, comes from Pipestone, Minnesota, which is actually not very far from here. If you haven't taken the vacation to go up and visit the pipestone quarries, even if you're not interested in this at all, it's a lovely place to hike, isn't it? There's waterfalls and stuff, and you're like out in the middle of the prairie, you're like, a waterfall, wow. But you can see they had to excavate through feet and feet of Sioux quartzite, which is 7 on a 1 to 10 hardness scale, to get to a little thin bed of pipestone. And they did it with pre-contact level technology. Native Americans still mine pipestone there. They still, in fact, this pipe was made by one of the artisans that works there. So this is, it's not a replica, but it's a modern pipe. It's not an artifact from a prehistoric site. And when I asked about them, I know pipes have a lot of sacred things associated with their religion and their ritual. And I said, can I use this one for a demonstration? He says, that one's yours. It hasn't been blessed. You said you could take it to your own church and bless it. You can do anything you want to with it. Once it's been designated for a ceremony, then they are very, it's an important kind of thing. So this one is not a sacred pipe. This is but I still think it's lovely. Oh, and this one, this is an ear spool. If you've seen people wear gauges where they stretch their earlobes bigger and bigger and put those things in, I always show this to the kids and you go, you mean a gauge? Yeah, you thought it was fashionable now, but it was also fashionable about 2,000 years ago. So it's chipped and ground just like that. So jewelry as well. And in Lyon County, there's a big site up there called Blood Run. If you cross the river into South Dakota, they've turned theirs half into the Good Earth State Park. Iowa has approved the idea of turning our half into a state park as well. It's an important archaeological site. But unfortunately, it's also, they've approved the idea, but there's no funding for it. So that's all on hold right now. But one of the things we find up there, and this is within walking distance of the pipestone quarries, we find the garbage. These are all chunks left over that you've cut off from making a pipe. That's the trash. Or perhaps some of these I look at and I think, oh, somebody started to drill a hole in it and it cracked, and start again. Here's a blank, all ready to go. And we also find lots and lots of these little guys. Gonna play with me today? Yeah. Little tiny stone tools. Look how tiny it is. What the heck is it used for? Well, if you put it on a handle, this is the drill for drilling out the insides of your pipe. So lots and lots of those were found out there. And go, oh, okay, I get it. I know what's going on now. For a while, kind of mystified by these tiny little stone tools. But we also know that there are artifacts made out of bone as well. As I say, there's a 7,000-year-old flute from Cherokee, Iowa, made on a swan wing. And it had the finger holes drilled out in it, and probably this same kind of tiny little stone tool used for that technology as well. So, and rocks. Probably the least lovely artifact in the state of Iowa, but by all means, the most common artifact in the state of Iowa is fire-cracked rock. It's local rock you can pick up, basalt, whatever the glaciers dragged in, cobbles out of the streams, things like that. I was asked earlier during the interview, how do you find archaeological sites? Well, if you walk out into a plowed field, or if you look at a river cut bank and you start seeing fire-cracked rock, you're there. As I say, nobody's going to take it home. Nobody's going to make a lovely arrangement for it in a frame.
Fire-cracked rock?
Fire-cracked rock, right. So if I take a piece of quartzite and I put it around a fire, it's going to expand and contract from heat, and eventually it breaks apart. But it changes color, and it gets these fine little cracks in it. And then after a while, it loses its ability to retain heat. And so they pitch it and get some more. That's why there is so much of it. But put it around a hearth to keep your fire in place. And this is one that we excavated in Guthrie County last summer. This is a stone-lined oven. This site had more fire-cracked rock. But we found it in place. You can see the basin shape here? And it's sitting on, this earth has been heated so much that it's baked. Over here to the side where she's sitting, tons of fire-cracked rock. And just down from that, a big hearth full of charcoal and more fire-cracked rock. So this was the oven. Think Hawaiian luau. You dig a pit in the ground, you line it with hot rocks, you put your meat in there, whatever you want, you put more hot rocks in there, you pile the dirt on the top, let it roast or steam, whatever you're doing, you dig it up and you've got dinner. Pitch those rocks, lots of fire-cracked rock. So as unlovely as it is, it's really cool. And I love these ovens and hearths. Found a bunch in Oklahoma once too, and they were roasting acorns and walnuts and things like that. So I had charred nuts and fire-cracked rock everywhere. So, fun with rocks. Bone. I've probably been talking way too long already, and I'm just getting to my favorite subject, bone tools. We have bone you can carve like wood, but it's harder and stronger and lasts longer. So we find awls made out of bones. We find beads made out of bone. Bird bones, rabbit bones are naturally hollow. So all you have to do is cut them up. Here's that Cherokee, that flute from Cherokee. Agriculture. Plants were first domesticated in Iowa, or the first plants were probably brought in from down around St. Louis about 3,000 years ago in Iowa. And this is the scapula hoe that they used to garden with. This one is made with a deer scapula because they're ever so much easier to get. They were normally made with a buffalo scapula. So you have to picture something this size. And this is actually just a cow. I'm working my way up to a buffalo. So this is an unmodified one. So when we find them with this big spine cut off here, like this, sometimes this thin edge has also been cut. And we find pits full of these things. Two free hoes with every dead buffalo. And the ladies were like, bring those over here, I need them. So picture this. This is Buffalo Bird Woman, taught us how these things were made. She actually made one for Gilbert Wilson. This is tied on with sinew, rawhide sinew. Rawhide shrinks. So as you pull it tight and then get it wet, and as it dries, it shrinks up even more. Buffalo Bird Woman. The short handle is apparently accurate, so you did hoe bent over. I think personally, my idea, I don't know if this has ever been tested for sure, but I think it's because of the weight. If you have an iron or a metal hoe on here, there's a lot of weight just pounding down on the ground, but the bone isn't that heavy, so I think you had to choke up and bone. But Buffalo Bird Woman specified that you don't hoe like this, like you do with an iron hoe, but you do one corner to the other corner, and that kept it from loosening up. I brought my bone whistle. This is a replica. When we worked at Plymouth County a couple years ago, which was damaged in a big flood, they were so excited. They found a bone whistle, and they brought it in. They look what we found. I said, oh, I've got one of those. And they, what? I said, yes, this is a bone whistle made out of a turkey bone. And then, as long as we're drilling holes in things, we also find lots of these. These are deer toes. These be the equivalent of these bones on us, phalanges. But if you drill a hole in them, again, people were like, what is it? Is it a necklace? Is it jewelry? What is it? It's a toy. And the game is, to try and skewer it like this. We pretend that happens a lot. So these are up here for you all to try. But again, toys and games, they had lots of these kinds of things. I wanted to show you some of the things that, again, I say we're happy to find the garbage, the stuff that didn't quite make it, because that tells us how they did it. So if you take a bone cylinder, when you find the bead, it's all polished and shiny and looks perfectly good. But if you find the beads that didn't make it, so what you do is you take your bone and you, come on, you're the pointer. You cut a groove around here, and then you snap it. And if you're lucky, it snaps on the dotted line. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we find the ones that for some reason didn't get finished or that broke wrong, things like that. And so that begins to tell us how these things were made. So the fishing hooks, we find small bone fish hooks. Oh, and the drills. Drills of all different sizes, from the little teenies up to great big ones. So all kinds of working for woodworking and bone working and things like that. Again, the flute. Here's a bear canine with a hole drilled in it. This probably would have been a necklace or something that you could sew onto your shirt or your dress. This is where garbage is fun. This is how to make a bone fish hook, or in this case, actually, 2 bone fish hooks. If you can imagine trying to whittle a piece of bone into a fish hook this big, no, it would be really difficult, wouldn't it? But if you start with a nice flat piece of bone, like a rib, and you drill 2 holes in it, okay, we've got our bone drills, they work quite well. And then you take a gouge. I go back just a little. It's a graving tool, a sharp-pointed stone tool, and they're gouging out the middle of this with it. So now I've got my rib and I've got my bone tool. This is not a difficult thing to do. So I gouge it out until I get this shape. I can then use my grinding technology, my sandstone tools, to get a shape like this. And then all I have to do is cut it here, and you can see I have 2 fish hooks. Now I could take my little sandstone grinding stone, sharpen them up, cut a little groove for tying the string to it. I have 2 fish hooks. Slick. I like it. And all because archaeologists save everything, including the garbage. Garbage tells us a lot. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about ceramic technology, making pottery. Pottery shows up about 2,000 years ago. It's not an accident that pottery and agriculture show up at the same time. Prior to this, undoubtedly people had containers, probably carved out of wood. We also know that they made basketry. How do we know they made basketry? I'll show you in a minute. They probably also, we know also that even historically, they used bladders from buffalo and things like that. This is a self-sealed container. No seams, no edges, things like that. So there are lots of other containers, but now you're growing food. You've got to, grow your grains, you dry it, you save it. You know, it's got to get you all the way through the winter, so it's got to be really super dry. So how do you cook it up again? Now you need to soak it and stew it. And these things were usually made into stews and things like that. So you need those pots. You also need your pots to save your seeds in for next year's planting. So pottery kind of comes along with agriculture. So from many different studies of experimenting and talking to ethnographic information and experimentation like you see here, we figured out how to make pottery. So you dig the clay. They included tempering material in the clay. In this case, it's burned and crushed shell. So they gathered mussel shells, they burned them in the fire and ground them up into tiny pieces. Sometimes we also find pottery with sand or grit, crushed rock mixed in with it. What this does is when it's mixed in with the clay, it helps keep it from breaking apart when it's fired. If you remember, if you had a crack in your windshield, they would drill a hole at the end of the crack, so to keep it from continuing all the way across. Well, the same thing happens with the pot. If the pot starts to crack, it'll travel through it until it hits that piece of tempering, and then it stops. And you're much less likely to get a piece blown out of your pot while it was fired. Don't know who figured it out, but somebody did. You then shape your pottery and dry it around the fire. Look, more fire-cracked rock. You create an oven, build a fire over the top of it, and let it burn down to fire your pottery. Cool things happen when you do this. Depending on how they're arranged, this guy's got them stacked in there. In this one, they were arranged more, not stacked, but arranged around each other. But strange things happen depending on the amount of oxygen flow. So these are what we call firing clouds. These two were too close together, and then not enough oxygen got through there to burn out all the carbon. So it's got these gray firing clouds on there. The places where it was exposed, where the air circulated around it, you don't see that blackness. Sometimes that's just an accident. It doesn't hurt the pot. It just affects the way it looks. So sometimes you see them firing clouds like this. Well, some women, and it was the women in North America anyway, who did all of the potting. This woman liked the black. This is Maria of the Pueblo San Ildefonso. She's a modern Pueblo artist. I think actually she's gone, but I think her descendants continue to make these pots. They like the black. So when they fire their pottery, they pile cow dung on top of it on purpose. And it gets really black because there's no oxygen in there and the carbon is forced into the pot. Then they take a small rock and they polish some areas of it and they leave the other areas matte and sell them for $5,000 a piece. So they could use this blackening intentionally. They also knew and understood that different kinds of clay fired in different colors, depending on what the mineral content was. So in this case, the pottery, and this is pre-contact pot from the Southwest, the clay fired beige, but they made a slip out of a different kind of clay that fired red and painted on and lined the interior with it. So two different colors. And then they added paint on the outside. So the ladies were not only making practical pottery, but they were making artwork as well. You know, you can have your dishes or you can just have pretty dishes. So pottery technology, this is a cool thing that somebody made for us, starts with coiling. In North America, they didn't use a wheel, but one of the women that Gilbert Wilson interviewed was a lady named Haury-Artz, and she kept talking about how she worked it in her lap. And a friend of mine who does pottery replication said, he said, how'd you work it in her lap? How'd you work it in her lap? He said, finally it dawned on him one day, she was wearing a skirt. So if you have a skirt on, you can put it here and continue to work, turning it around and around and around as you work. So Wade stands up and then puts on his apron and continues to work. So you start building a coil pot. You have to pinch the seams together, and then you have to make sure there are no air bubbles in there, and you want it to be thin as possible. So there you are. I worked them usually with a cord wrap paddle. And the way you do that is to put your hand inside. You might be holding a cloth or something, and you paddle it, and paddle it, and paddle it until it's thin enough, and you can draw it up and shape it. And then you can decorate it. Sometimes we continue to find the cord markings on it from the paddle. Sometimes they smooth that over. But look closely. It's a small group, so we can just get up close and personal with these. This is all real pottery from Iowa. This one, you can see the shell tempering in it. It shows up quite clearly. And it's completely smoothed over, but the rim, if you look closely, can you figure out what was used for decorating it?
Kind of pinched, wasn't it?
Yeah, but look at the little grooves.
I have no idea.
Fingernail.
Fingernails.
Oh, okay.
Yep, so somebody went along and just went. This one, We have the bosses here punched in from the back. Here, you can pass them on around. But this decoration, this is what we call simple stamped. So a carved piece of wood or bone, almost like a little toothbrush, worked around the rim to make decorations. Pass that one around.
Are these real old pieces or just?
Yes, these are real old ones. So this is real pottery from around Iowa. As I say, it always comes in pieces.
Yeah.
This one, you can see the cord from a tool like this. So this all just comes from experimenting. We look at the designs and try and figure out, and so you just play with clay and try and make those designs again. And this one you can see the smoothed over cord markings. So it's not completely smoothed out. And this one, a big chunky one, and again, you can see the tempering material. In this case, it's crushed rock. But this is a big thick piece, so it's probably from the base of a pot. That one, they didn't smooth it over at all. So you can still see the cord markings. I don't have a sample of one with me, but one of the other designs we found, if you roll a corn cob across it, it makes a really cool kind of design on there. It took a while to figure that one out. We also have sometimes carved paddles too. It looks like probably carved out of wood. We don't find the paddles, but from experimentation, we try and come up with these kinds of designs. And then
Where do these people have all the time to do all this?
they had plenty of time, actually.
No
TV.
Yeah, right, exactly. There you go. You can sit around and do this while you're telling stories, while you're educating the kids, while something's baking in your pit oven. The interesting thing is, too, though, if you talk to Native American women, their designs were personal. And again, this is from the ethnographic record, but one woman said, if you wanted her to teach you how to make pots, she would say, okay, 3 well-prepared hides. So you prepare the hides and bring them over, and then she would teach you. But she wouldn't let you use her designs until you made them to her satisfaction. She's not having you go out and use her design sloppily. You had to do it right, or you didn't use it at all. Exactly, yeah. And in fact, Hides and Eats, who was one of the people that Gilbert Wilson interviewed, kept saying she was not a potter. At this point in time, 90% of the Mandan had died from the smallpox and polio epidemics and things like that. So the knowledge that was removed is staggering. So she said there was nobody left who were the actual potters. So she was trying to show him what she remembered watching people do, but she had never been trained to do it. So she kept thinking, I think this is it, but I'm not a potter. The women, the people who knew how to build the earth lodges, not everybody knew that. Again, you had to pay somebody to build your earth lodge or to teach you how to use some of these skills. So when you think 90% of the population is gone, the amount of knowledge that must have been lost is staggering. But we also find in one of my favorites in Iowa, and again, I didn't bring a good sample of it, is we see designs pressed in the clay. It's just a piece of string that was used in there. Are we ever going to find the string in an archaeological record? No. But when we see it in the pot, pressed into a pot, I know that they made string. So the last thing we're going to talk about, even though I'm out of time, is fiber technology. This is a Wampanoag home. The Wampanoag were the Indians that met the Pilgrims. So at Plymouth, Massachusetts, there is a big village, a living history place for Pilgrim settlement. Near that is a Wampanoag living history farm, living history village. I like it so much better than the living history farms here because they actually live there. And I understand why they don't have people living at the one in living history farms here in Iowa, because you don't want people pretending to be Indians. That's kind of insulting. But they don't have anybody living there, so the homes don't look warm and cozy and friendly and comfortable. So I like this picture because it does look quite comfortable. This is inside a wickiup. Look at the mats hanging on the walls. You know, this is not just bare bark or something, or cobwebs and things like that. And they're not just mats. They're decorated, they're dyed different colors, they're woven in different patterns. So these things, added insulation. You had the bark, and you had the mat, and you had, so that's an insulated airspace. But it's also lovely. They also stored no closets in a wickiup. So they had things in bags and baskets hanging from the ceiling.
The lights down a little lower?
Yeah, if you could. One of my friend, Suzanne Buffalo, who is Meskwaki, and the Meskwaki also built wickiups. That was their winter home. She said, we still hang stuff on the ceiling. She said, I don't know if anybody else does that or not, but you walk into a Meskwaki house and there's stuff hanging from the ceilings and stuff like that, Jude. I think that probably goes back to this time. So this looks like a pretty cozy house. All of the furs on the beds and stuff like that. And it looks pretty comfy and cozy. So we know they had string because you had to have some way of tying on an arrowhead. And we also find pottery decorated with cordage. So the last question is, how do you do that? Sources. This is Jonathan Buffalo. He's the Meskwaki historian, culture historian, runs the museum there in the settlement. He's standing with cattails. They covered their exteriors of their wickiups with cattail mats. They had all those mats hanging on the inside like the Wampanoag did. So look how big they are. They're big. This kind of cattail has actually been extirpated from the state of Iowa. It's not here anymore, but it still grows in Oklahoma. And Meskwaki went down to the Kickapoo down in Oklahoma, and he said it was funny because we were out there in the swamp cutting cattails, and the Kickapoo were like, you guys are nuts. He said, we're having a cultural experience. But they are trying to reintroduce these cattails to their property at the settlement in Iowa so that they can grow them again. Another way, common way to do it is the inner bark of the basswood tree. You can also use nettles, yucca fibers, and deer sinew. Here's some of the fiber technology. This picture was taken in the 1800s. There's a Meskwaki wickiup covered in cattail mats. You can use cordage for basketry as well. None of this stuff is ever going to show up in the archaeological record, but this woman who's demonstrating how to make a cattail mat is using a bone needle. And we do find those. We go, yes, they were making them. And how you do it, it's the exact same way that a spinning wheel works now. And I find that it works better to demonstrate it with string. You start out with 2 fibers, and you twist them. And when I let it go, it twists up. I pinch it here. Oh, I went the wrong way. Pinch it again. And I've got 2-ply cord. I could do it again and make 4-ply, 8-ply. It's the same way rope's done now. They just have machines to do the twisting instead. And it's what a spinning wheel does as well when you're twisting the fibers together, but it stays. If I just took them and wrapped them around each other, it would unwind again. So I have some to show you. Yeah. So this is sinew from deer sinew. So if you start with these, pound them up pretty good on a rock, you'll get this kind of stringy fiber. Twist them together, and there's deer sinew string.
That's the bone? The bone that you cut out from the fiber of the...
Yeah, right, so the sinew here like that. And then this is basswood fiber from the inner bark of the basswood tree. And if you want to know how warped my family is, here's my daughter, who is happily, she was an intern at Springbrook State Park that summer, or that winter. A lot of deer died in the woods. So being my daughter, she gathered up the legs and stripped out the tendons and made fiber out of them. And unfortunately, she failed to weigh the rocks. But this big bucket full of rocks, and it's being held by single ply sinew fiber, and the handle of the bucket broke first. She's still happily educating people. So here's the fiber technology. You strip the bark, soak it in the water, and then you can strip the fibers off the interior and make all kinds of wonderful string for all kinds of purposes. Think of all the stuff you use string for. And then wood, building a house. This is an earth lodge. These were the homes lived down in western Iowa. Big earth lodge village over in Plymouth County. Oneota villages. Buffalo Bird Woman was one of the people who knew how to build an earth lodge. She said, you start about 5 years ahead of time. This is in North Dakota. Not a lot of timber in North Dakota. It's a prairie. So gathering wood, she said you start about 5 years before you want to start building an earth lodge. And then you have to have it all dry because you don't want to get it in there and have it twist or warp or something like that. So this is just a real quick picture of archaeologists having a good time trying to build an earth lodge. You can see how much lumber it takes to build the frame. Then the smaller branches are woven on the top. You can see it's a pretty sturdy building. There are people walking around on top of it. Lewis and Clark stayed in the Mandan Earth Lodge Village their first winter. They first thought as they paddled up the river that people were walking in and out of the hills because eventually grass grows on top of them and stuff. The Meskwaki, the Iowa, the Ho-Chunk, many of the eastern tribes, eastern part of the state built smaller wickiup houses. These are their winter homes. The Meskwaki one with mats on it, an Iowa home with bark. This is flattened tree bark covering the outside of that one. That's the same, the Wampanoag house in Massachusetts was also covered in bark. And then in the summer, when they got together in their big summer villages to plant their crops, they built larger longhouses like this. But again, this is a little scene painted by a man named Tom Wilcoxon, who has a really great kids book about the Meskwaki. But this one is an old house, so they've just come back and they're repairing the roof, putting out new bark covering it, a new house being built over here. They're weaving mats, unrolling the mats to cover it. They rolled up the mats from the wickiup and stored them in the rafters of these houses where the smoke would keep the insects out of them. So again, using your brains. So art, music, games and toys, all kinds of good things are made with all these cool technologies. So if you want to learn more, there's our website, archaeology@uiowa.edu, or just do a Google search, you'll find us. Any questions? I mean, I know I've run over time.
Thank you.
And I like your question about how do they have time? You know, again, no TV is probably a lot to do with it, but people were
Stuff to do.
always busy, and yet time for making things pretty. It wasn't just quick throw a pot together to bake stuff, but let's decorate the pot, make it pretty. But I think that's an instinct that all humans have. You know, you've got a creative urge. You want to, you know, decorate things or experiment with something. Let's see what happens if I roll a corn cob across it. Oh, that looks kind of cool.
Well, thank you, Cherie. We appreciate you being here.
Oh, I appreciate it too.
Yeah, thank you, SMU, for coming here, and I hope you all have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Don't get too wet.
Yes.